Thank you very much, David. This is some great food for thought, but please hold your questions and comments until after the three papers. The next one is by David Landau from Florida State University College of Law. The organizers have asked the moderators to not expand on the bios of the speakers, as you can read those in the folder. So I invite you to do so. And we will go straight to David's paper, which is entitled Intertemporal Theories of Judicial Role. And it considers the ways in which Global South contexts are remaking theories of judicial role and the separation of powers. David, you have 20 minutes.
Great. Well, this project really jumps off of work that I've been doing for a long time and that draws heavily on my own kind of base of field work, which has been in Colombia. And what I'm trying to think about really with respect to this paper is to what extent can we say that there's a distinctive theory of judicial role in what has been called in a lot of recent work the Global South. So newer democracies, more fragile democracies. And I think the term has been used a lot in recent work. But there's been a lot of difficulty, I think, in pinning down exactly what constitutionalism of the Global South is. To some degree, the suggestion is, well, it's a set of topics that come up with particular force in this context. Problems like indigenous rights, problems like social rights, for example. But of course, these problems don't come up exclusively in the Global South. They're problems everywhere. And so I was trying to come up with whether there actually is something distinctive about judicial role. And I think the answer is a sort of qualified yes. Yes, there are differences. There are differences really of degree rather than in kind. I won't go through this much here. I go through it more in the paper. But I think if one looks at constitutional theory, particularly in the context I know best, which is the U.S., the constitutional theories that come out of the U.S. are quite loose. They're better seen, I think, as frameworks or set of questions rather than answers, and they're heavily contested, right? So if you take a central organizing principle of U.S. constitutionalism, like the counter-majoritarian difficulty, the problem of courts acting against democratic majorities, which has really dominated U.S. constitutional theory for a while, the answers to that question have varied significantly through time based on sort of political valence. And what courts have done, what the U.S. Supreme Court, for example, has done through time has varied quite a bit. Right? So if one looks at what the U.S. Supreme Court is doing now versus what the U.S. Supreme Court was doing 30 years ago, it's a rather different conception of role. So at the outset, I want to say that I think that these are questions or issues that run across countries. Nonetheless, I think that there is some set of questions that tends to run out of these contexts that has a somewhat different emphasis, and I'll explain that in a second. So what I guess I'm trying to do here really is to sort of fit or come up with a set of questions that I think fit a set of practices, right? And I'm painting with a broad brush here, obviously, but it's a set of constitutional design practices that respond in some ways to, as I say in the paper, different sorts of political dysfunctions, right? So the first one might call the problem of fragility, right? The problem of potential democratic erosion. And so one sees a number of responses to this in modern constitutionalism, one of which is constitutional tiering. So you might make certain parts of the Constitution particularly difficult to change in an effort to prevent sensitive parts of the constitutional order from being overthrown. So obviously the South African Constitution is an example of a constitution that engages in some tiering where some parts of the Constitution are harder to change than others. Probably more dramatically, the unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrine, I think, is an example of this set of practices. This is obviously, has been described in some of the literature, the most extreme of counter-majoritarian acts, right? You've got a court not only second guessing democratic majorities, but second guessing attempts of democratic supermajorities to alter the Constitution. And yet, as I think is made clear by recent literature, it's been a pretty successful doctrine, right? It's something that one sees in a number of different contexts. A second problem I think that shows up in kind of modern institutional design, particularly in Global South contexts, is a kind of thick constitution with a number of checking institutions. So you have thick, very thick texts, right? In some ways, this is just true of global constitutionalism outside of the U.S. more generally. I think here the U.S. is close to an outlier, and I think in some ways that's a response to distrust of democratic majorities. In other words, you pin more down now and give sort of less space to democratic majorities to act. And you also set up a number of checking institutions. So not courts themselves are insufficient. You also need other things like electoral courts, ombudsmen, human rights commissions, a number of different sets of institutions that in part, I think, take policy-making authority away from democratic majorities. They do a number of things, but that I think is at least one thing they do. And third, I think, and this is probably the sort of vaguest or hardest to get your sort of head around, but a set of jurisprudence and scholarship that I think in various ways focuses on political dysfunction. This is not the same across countries. Political contexts vary in sharp and very important ways across countries. So it might be a set of scholarship that's focused at least partly on the problem of a dominant party system. It might be the problem of courts dealing with legislatures that tend to abdicate, that tend not to do their job, as one sees in Colombia, which I think is also partly a product of a certain type of party system. But one sees at least a kind of focus by judges and commentators on these sorts of problems. Fine, so what sorts of answers then does this fit? What sort of theoretical apparatus does one see kind of come out of this? And one possibility is, well, it's all just dominated by pragmatic considerations. So it's all in fact really about political context. And what the court can do is essentially what the court can get away with, right? So in a dominant party system, you've got less room. And that may be true, right? I think there's certainly, no one would deny the important role the political context plays, but I think it's not completely true, right? I think there is room for normative theorizing about what it is that courts ought to be doing in different contexts. And even in more constrained contexts, that sort of normative theorizing, I think, is useful in raising questions about judicial role. So I give sort of two answers to the paper, again, both of which I think come to some degree out of the Colombian case, but I think that one sees elsewhere as well. The first is, and I guess broadly speaking, I say that these are intertemporal, and what I mean by that is to some degree they subordinate one question, which is the court acting like a court, or is it infringing on the role of the political branches, for a second question, which is what is the effect of what the court does through time on the system, right? And I think you could take sort of two frameworks to answer that question. The first is the court's role in particular is to realize the constitutional project, and the court has to do what it needs to do to carry out that project to some degree. So this suggests, particularly when the political branches are not doing their job, they're not acting properly, the court gets a kind of a warrant to take some kind of action to ensure that important constitutional principles are carried out. Examples here, two famous Colombian cases, T2504, which is the displaced persons case, and T76008, which is a health case, both of which are essentially structural cases, massive structural cases where the court intervened in public policy for internally displaced persons and health, respectively. And I think in both of these cases, a big part of the court's justification was that the existing public policy that was being carried out by the legislature, and particularly in those cases the bureaucracy, was insufficient. And that gave the court some license to take aggressive action. These are major cases where the court has, for example, held on to jurisdiction for a number of years, issued a number of follow-up orders, created, as I'll explain in more detail a little later, civil society commissions to sort of monitor compliance with these cases. So these are examples of the court acting in a relatively aggressive manner and undertaking major orders. I mean, the internally displaced persons example is a good one where you've got, depending on the statistics, maybe 3 million internally displaced persons in the country, and the court essentially in 2004 says you have you were carrying out sort of no public policy on this matter. We're going to step in and start issuing orders to make sure that you develop a program, right, along these lines. So I think that this sort of a theoretical apparatus works, right, in some ways. I mean, I think it's intuitively very appealing that, particularly when you take an institution like a constitutional court, which is given primary power to enforce the Constitution, that you would be able to relax, right, or sort of get around at least some constraints on judicial role in order to improve the performance or in order to carry out the constitutional project through time. And I think it's a useful frame because it does raise sort of interesting and important questions, right? I mean, one of which you might call a sort of prioritization question, right? So, okay, so the other branches are not carrying out health policy adequately, or they're not carrying out policy with respect to IDPs adequately. Why these issues, right? Why not other issues? There are a number of issues, right, within Colombia, one could say the same about South Africa, where there are deficient public policies, right, where the constitutional goals are not that close to being realized. And so one might ask, why these, right? Why these questions? And I think that in a way that the court's focus in these cases has been on, well, what are the, internally, what are the kinds of complaints that it gets through time, right? So if it gets a number of individual complaints over a number of years, then it's more likely to issue a sort of structural order. And there's also, and this is a little bit more maybe alarming, there's a kind of path dependence to it, right? Where I think these two cases took up a lot of the court's resources, some of its legitimacy. And so there was a sense, you know, if one talked to the justices after these orders had been issued and were kind of in effect, that there was highly unlikely to be another major structural case. It's partly because of turnover of personnel, but partly just because there's kind of a limit to how many of these kinds of structural interventions one could undertake. I think the court, you know, I think that courts can give good answers to why they prioritize some parts of the Constitution over others. But I think that when a court takes on this kind of a role, right, it has to give those answers. I think that becomes part of the responsibility of the court. There's a second sort of issue, I think, that comes into this, which is if a court is carrying out this kind of constitutional realization role, what is the fit with other political institutions, right? In other words, I don't think that one can say, well, institutional considerations go away just because the court is sort of taking on this kind of role. Obviously, an easy answer would be it would sort of reconcile everything. If the court was normally able to take a kind of deferential stance, say, well, you've got to develop a program, you're neglecting your constitutional duties, and that's all we're going to say about it, right? Unfortunately, I think that in most political contexts doesn't work. It's not necessarily going to get you anywhere, or at least not going to get you as far as one would like. So the question is then, what else is justified, right? And I think broadly speaking, in the Colombian context, what one sees is a kind of ratchet model to some degree, a sort of ongoing dialogue, but certainly a kind of ratchet model where the orders become more specific through time. So initially they're relatively broad. The state might respond to some of these points, but not others. The court through time, after holding public hearings and sort of getting follow-up reports, issues more specific sets of orders. I tend to think that that's justified, right? Certainly that involves the court in making policy making to a significant degree. I think it's undeniable. But it seems to me justified under the imperative of carrying out the constitutional project, a big part of the answer as to whether this could be justified or not, I think, is dependent not on whether the court is sufficiently court-like or not, but on what this does to the political system through time, right? And I think that's the hard question we don't really have a great answer to. But I think in the Colombian context, to some degree, what one observes is something like, this is too optimistic, but something like a virtuous circle where the court over time issues important decisions on the Constitution, really pushes the political branches to carry out these orders, and the legislative and executive branch start to take constitutional principles and the Constitution more seriously as a result. So if that's right, I think it justifies what the court does, right? But I think the point is the justification has to be in the effect of the activism, I think, through time. So a second frame I think one could look at in analyzing judicial role is improvement of political institutions, right? So the idea here is, the idea of the first frame is the goal of the court over time is to carry out the constitutional project. The idea here is, since at least some of this active judicial role is a response to political dysfunction, what you want courts to do through time is to improve the way political institutions work, right? And I think if one looks at the two big structural cases, again, T205 and T760, one could see them in part, I think, as also having the goal of improving the performance of the political system in some ways. They're a particular kind of strategy that I've described elsewhere as a kind of outsider strategy. In other words, you're not working on political institutions directly, but you're trying to create spaces for democratic dialogue outside of the political branches. And here I think the procedure that the court employed in both of these cases is really important. Again, it created these sort of follow-up commissions composed of civil society actors that were not peripheral but played a major role in monitoring the decision and coming up with policy ideas. It held kind of periodic public hearings, sometimes televised, that were at times kind of major events. There you bring in state actors, you bring in the civil society groups, you have a sort of discussion about compliance. And so what this did in a way is gave space for civil society groups, in some ways for other actors, to have an influence on public policy, certainly to discuss public policy outside of the political institutions themselves, which were potentially dysfunctional, right? So I think that, I think again, this kind of role, one does not want to overstate what a court could do to a political system, right? But at the same time, I think it's a reasonable justification, right, that a court should aim at least some of its energy towards this goal. There are, again, I think, sort of major questions, right? One of which is, well, what sort of strategies work? What effect does a very activist court have on the political system through time? Again, we don't have definitive answers to that. I think the answers in the Colombian context have been largely positive, right? I think one does observe at least some dynamics of a kind of virtuous circle. And then the other question would be, well, what might this justify, right? How far does this go? And here's where I think it's still quite troubling. I mean, I'll discuss very briefly a case I see as an extremely hard case, which is C-288 of 2012. This is a case involving use of the unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrine, this super strong doctrine that I sort of discussed earlier, where the court nonetheless has had a pretty active doctrine, a sort of use of this power. The most famous case is the one involving a popular President Alvaro Uribe's attempt to get a third consecutive term in office. So amended the Constitution sort of twice to get himself another term, and the second time he wanted to amend the Constitution by referendum, the court said, this would be a substitution of the Constitution, you can't do this. In that case, potentially preventing some kind of an erosion of the democratic order. This case, I think, is a harder use, right? So what the court was asked to do here was review an amendment to the Constitution that created a principle of fiscal sustainability and also created a sort of special judicial action of sort of fiscal review. This was a kind of vague amendment that was changed a lot through the course of its passage. But it's clear that an impetus for it was judicial decisions that were seen as costing the state money, right? That was at least the initial impetus. And so the decision creates this principle of fiscal sustainability. It doesn't quite say what it is, right? And it is weakened a decent amount in passage. And it's challenged, they say, that the challenge basically says, you're subordinating the social state of law, a fundamental principle of Colombian constitutionalism, to fiscal considerations. You can't do that, right? You've got to put rights first. In other words, you can't subordinate the rights to fiscal considerations. And the court says, no, it's not a substitution of the Constitution, but it's not a substitution of the Constitution because we're going to read it in a very particular way. And it does not mean all that much. Fiscal sustainability, the way we read it, is a kind of instrument. It's not on the same plane as the social state of law. It's just an instrument that kind of runs subordinate to it. So you can't use it as a justification not to carry out or not to enforce fundamental rights. That's the sort of, they've backed off or altered that a little in subsequent decisions, but that's the core reasoning of that decision. Why do I say this is a hard case? Well, I mean, I think on the one hand, it's not a fragility case where the democratic order itself is in jeopardy, right? On the other hand, it's not just the court protecting its own jurisprudence either. It's somewhere in between, right? It's about the court protecting fundamental principle of Colombian constitutionalism, which is the kind of prevalence of rights, and in particular the prevalence of social rights within the constitutional order. Should it do it, right? One might say, well, no, democratic majorities, at least through changing the Constitution, have the ability to make a major change, the constitutional structure. If they actually wanted to subordinate rights, or at least make them subject to fiscal availability, they ought to be able to do it, right? But in the Colombian context, where one sees a developing but still weak constitutional culture and a kind of problematic political system, one might argue, I would argue, right, that the decision, although very hard, is justifiable, right? That one could certainly justify even that very active use of judicial review in that context. So I guess the project overall, to conclude very briefly, say judicial role is not different in kind, right, in these contexts, but I think it is fair to say it's different in degree, and that the differences in degree really matter, right? And the other thing is that some questions I think are more productive than others in constitutional theory. And the question of whether you're acting court-like or not, although good for rhetorical debates at various points, I think are ultimately less answerable and less helpful than the question of what effect a court has on the constitutional order and on a political system through time. And I think that those ultimately somewhat empirical questions are where we ought to focus our energy. Thanks.
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.